The Subcommittee on Space will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing titled Commercial Space. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and required truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The Commercial Space Launch Act was passed nearly 30 years ago and was the turning point for the growth of the commercial space sector in our economy. The advent of the commercial space industry brought with it advances in space launch, communications, entertainment, position, navigation, and timing technology, weather monitoring, remote sensing, space tourism, science experimentation, and expanded human spaceflight. The latest data available suggests the economic impact of the commercial space industry is approximately $208 billion. Congress has provided the federal government with various mechanisms to leverage the private sector, such as the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program and the Commercial Crew Program, FAA experimental permits, human spaceflight regulation moratorium, prize authority, and various public-private partnership authorities. As Congress continues to look for ways to maintain the United States' preeminence in space and grow our economy, it is clear that the promise of the commercial space industry warrants additional attention. We must ensure that export controls and international trafficking and arms regulations are rational and productive. We need to provide stable, certain, and competitive regulatory environments at the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that facilitate domestic investment. There is no question that our commercial partners have a valuable role to play in our nation's spaceflight and exploration in the coming years, but there will be trade-offs. We must continue to weigh whether potential cost savings come at the expense of overall capabilities, robustness, or safety. We must also recognize there are core fundamental operations that will still need to be maintained by the federal government. The witnesses before us today represent a variety of perspectives on the commercial space industry, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. We're also pleased to have, or will have, the Majority Whip, Representative Kevin McCarthy, with us today. Representative McCarthy, along with Representative Bill Posey, introduced H.R. 3038, the Suborbital and Orbital Advancement and Regulatory Streamlining Act, or SOARS Act. The committee appreciates their leadership and willingness to work with us in developing policies that can grow our economy. Next year, we hope to take up a comprehensive commercial space bill to address these issues as well as many others. The commercial space industry has been invaluable to our successes in the past, and the future continues to look very bright. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, as well as with industry stakeholders, to come up with common sense policies that can help put people back to work, retain our skilled aerospace workforce, and protect our industrial base. Finally, I would like to address the perennial elephant in the room, commercial launch liability. This provision, which is so important to keeping our launch industry competitive in the international market, is set to expire once again at the end of the year. The NASA Authorization Act that passed this committee over the summer included an extension for 5 years. While I would have liked to see a long-term extension, it appears as though we have reached an agreement with the minority to only extend the provision for 1 year and take the issue up more thoroughly next year as part of a larger Commercial Space Launch Act. I look forward to sponsoring this extension along with Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, and Ranking Member Edwards. I hope we can discharge the bill and pass it under suspension of the rules on the House floor very shortly. With that, I yield the remainder of my time to my friend from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Over a half century ago, Congress established the Federal Aviation Administration with the mission of ensuring the safety of the flying public. Today, the FAA requires that new experimental vehicles designed to probe the fringes of outer space be as safe as a commercial airliner. Had the same stringency been applied to the automobile, Henry Ford's Model T might have never made it onto the streets. That's the situation that our country's space pioneers are faced with today. Under current U.S. law, experimental launch vehicles and experimental aircraft supporting them can be designed, built, and flown by our most innovative companies. But they can't charge for their services. Representative Kevin McCarthy and I introduced H.R. 3038, the SOARS Act, to change that. There's a private company at the Kennedy Space Center which NASA hired and the FAA licensed to conduct astronaut training and payload testing. I should say was licensed. 2 years ago, the FAA decided they made a mistake in allowing the company to fly their FAA-defined, quote, experimental, close quote, aircraft in support of NASA's launch activities, and so the FAA grounded them. Obviously, that was very bad news for the company, and that was a 100% safety record at NASA. It defies common sense that a long-standing NASA partner can be arbitrarily grounded by the FAA. We need to fix the problem by updating our laws so our space innovators have the freedom they need to innovate, and regulators, such as the FAA, have the appropriate amount of flexibility to strike the right balance. Congressman McCarthy and I believe this bill will do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. With that, I yield to the ranking member, the gentlewoman, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on commercial space, and welcome to our witnesses. Subcommittee Ranking Member Donna Edwards will join us shortly, and she asked me to take her place until then. Mr. Chairman, the Ranking Member also asked that her opening statement be included for the record. As many of the committee members have stated on several occasions, we see a strong link between the space program and the inspiration it provides to our younger generation through various STEM activities. Commercial space is an important component of that inspiration and a key source of jobs and innovation. The commercial satellite industry has experienced strong and steady growth over several years. I hope to hear today about what factors have contributed to such growth and how other commercial space ventures might learn from their successes. The audacious proposal from Mr. Tito and the entrepreneurial spirit overflowing at Mr. Witt's Mojave Spaceport demonstrate that America's yearning for deep space exploration and thirst for innovation are alive and well. But maintaining such enthusiasm requires a well-oiled partnership between the federal government, states, private industry, and academia. Thankfully, there are many indications to show that this partnership is alive and well. Just yesterday, the first high school-developed CubeSat was launched along with other payloads aboard the Air Force's ORS-3 mission on a Minotaur 1 rocket from NASA's Wallops facility. The Thomas Jefferson High School's CubeSat, known as TJ3SAT, is a joint project between the high school and industry partners to design and build a CubeSat to increase interest in aerospace technology. And a few weeks ago, I was pleased to see from my home state the Oregon Space Grant Consortium, which promotes STEM education through cooperative and interdisciplinary programs while recruiting and training NASA's next diverse workforce, announced its 2013-2014 scholarship recipients. This consortium, part of the National Space Grant College and Fellowship Program, is a statewide network of universities, colleges, museums, educators, researchers, students, and science professionals. Each of the scholarship recipients has expressed an interest in seeking a future in the aerospace, science, or education community and has attained the highest level of academic achievement. Our partnerships among government, industry, states, and academia need to match their goals, dedication, and high achievement with challenging and engaging work. So today I hope to hear our witnesses discuss their views on the state of the U.S. space workforce, how important STEM activities are to cultivating the skills that commercial space companies need, and what it will take to build the type of workforce that will eventually lead to our U.S. commercial space activities into the next century. Let's keep their inspiration alive by finding greater opportunities for partnership. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, again for holding this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee for a statement.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, too, for having this hearing today. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here as well to share their expertise on this subject. It's appropriate, and I know he will be here momentarily, to have Representative McCarthy join us today to discuss his bill, H.R. 3038, the SOARS Act. This legislation seeks to streamline the regulatory process. It also amends parts of the Commercial Space Launch Act to provide clarity regarding new systems and how they are defined. Reducing red tape for our space entrepreneurs is a necessary step to ensuring their continued growth. The commercial space industry offers improvements to the quality of life for every person on the planet. The discoveries and applications that have come from space technology number in the hundreds. The storied past of American ingenuity and exceptionalism is filled with examples of entrepreneurs who push the boundaries of the possible. The commercial space industry relies on this same creative spirit. America has always been a nation of innovators and explorers. We continue to remain on the forefront of new discoveries and technologies. This industry could yield results that blur the lines between science fiction and science fact. Students of tomorrow could go to college to study a whole new field that resulted from the development of private space exploration. Perhaps in the next 20 years, we will see new technologies and business models that result in private space laboratories. For example, advances in the suborbital space industry could yield the potential to send a package or people from New York to Hong Kong in a matter of minutes. The applications of this type of travel are limitless. And, Mr. Chairman, I know you're going to more formally introduce our witnesses in just a minute, but I want to mention a couple of items about them as well. Our witness today, one of our witnesses today is Mr. Dennis Tito, Chairman of the Inspiration Mars Foundation. This foundation is the type of private space endeavor we should encourage. Their mission to send humans to orbit Mars in 8 years or less using mostly existing technology might well catch the public's imagination. We're also pleased to have Mr. Stuart Witt, CEO of Mojave Air and Spaceport, and a former test pilot and Top Gun with us today as well. There are exciting things happening in the Mojave Desert, and I've been there myself. The work of private companies and the spaceport add great value to our nation's space assets. Our final witness represents an often overlooked part of the commercial space industry that has actually been around for a long time. Patricia Cooper is the president of the Satellite Industry Association, and the commercial satellite industry provides many of our modern conveniences, and we are grateful for her perspective as well. I look forward to today's hearing and to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to develop policies that encourage the growth of the commercial space industry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time, and yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask to be recognized just for a second more? I want to apologize to the witnesses and express my regret that another committee I serve on is having a markup, and I'm going to have to leave soon for that markup, so we won't be able to be here the whole time.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. At this time, we're just going to take a brief respite, and as we await the Majority Whip's arrival.
Mr. Chairman, there might be someone who'd want to say a few words about the great state of Texas while we're waiting.
Yeah, that's one of our redistricting rules. Senate district has two.
Just two per Senate district.
Yeah, two. It's not. So you draw the Senate district, divide them now.
Yeah.
All right. He's here?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Right.
At this time, I would like to introduce our first witness, the Honorable Kevin McCarthy, the Majority Whip of the House of Representatives and the representative from California's 23rd District. Mr. McCarthy, your spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Mr. McCarthy, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today and for allowing me the opportunity to testify in support of commercial space in the Suborbital and Orbital Advanced Regulatory Streamlining, the SOARS Act. I want to also thank Congressman Posey for working with me to introduce this important legislation and his support for commercial space. America is built on a strong heritage of exploration, discovery, and innovation. From President Thomas Jefferson's commissioning of the Lewis and Clark expedition to exploring the American West, to the transcontinental railway linking East and West together, to the public-private partnership that helped the airline industry grow to become a safe mode of travel all over the world, to the Internet, which has generated as much economic growth in 15 years as the Industrial Revolution did in 50. Space, like the Internet before the dot-com boom of the 1990s, was originally a government-run enterprise. Many believe that the commercial space flight is poised to have its own dot-com moment in the near future. NASA's Commercial Crew and Cargo program alone has already created thousands of high-quality jobs here in America, including many at NASA Dryden Flight Research Center, which I represent. My district is also home to Mojave Air and Spaceport, where many commercial space flight companies have located to research, develop, and test their hardware that will soon take Americans back to space. This is why I support the commercial space flight industry. The creation of thousands of good-paying jobs on U.S. soil and the continuation of Americans' legacy in space exploration and innovative technologies. Think about this. Over the last 50 years, about 500 humans have been to space. With the commercial space market, the number could double over the next 10 years. With the government only serving as a customer, the next U.S. astronaut to fly to space on American rockets will do so because of this new model. The use of innovative public-private partnership offers the government new ways to solving problems. A study shows these partnerships benefit the taxpayer by providing space services at nearly one-tenth the cost of traditional contracting methods, getting results for less money, getting innovation growth, and risk-sharing in the private sector. As NASA leads continued exploration missions and related technology development, entrepreneurs will follow, spending their own money and creating new industries. However, it is up to us as legislators to ensure our current regulatory environment is appropriate for the needs of the 21st century, and to make sure safety is paramount in the commercial spaceflight industry's endeavor. This is why I introduced H.R. 3038, to ensure that the U.S. commercial spaceflight industry has a clear path ahead of it, continues to innovate and generate high-quality American manufacturing jobs. A robust commercial space industry will also help attract students to the STEM fields of education by inspiring the next generation to literally reach for the stars. The goal of this bill is to streamline the regulatory process for commercial spacecraft, ensuring that Americans remain a leader in commercial space flight, while providing the Secretary of Transportation the necessary tools to help the industry operate safely. The commercial space flight industry is one of our newest, fastest growing, and most innovative industries. And I'm proud of the Dryden Flight Research Center and the Mojave Air and Spaceport are leading the way. And if we take the right steps, we won't be just launching rockets. We'll be launching new careers, new industries, and new economic opportunities. Whenever I visit these facilities, and I will tell you, when you hear from Stu Witt later, I go to Mojave Air more than any place else in my district because it's innovative, it's fast-moving, and it's ever-changing. And it's not just changing for California, the United States, it's changing the world. And we're doing it in a private-public partnership that's been seen no other place. So the real possibilities will continue to grow. Again, you'll hear from Mojave's Executive Director, Stu Witt, who's also testifying today. But this legislation, along with Congressman Posey, is very simple. It is streamlining to make sure we keep the safety, but also maintain the growth and the leadership for America in spaceflight. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to testify, and I yield back my time.
I thank Mr. McCarthy for his valuable testimony. The witness is excused, and we will move to our second panel.
Thank you.
Our first witness is Ms. Patricia Cooper, President of the Satellite Industry Association. Our second witness is Mr. Stuart Witt, CEO and General Manager of the Mojave Air and Spaceport. And our third witness is Mr. Dennis Tito, Chairman of the Inspiration Mars Foundation. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Ms. Cooper, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the Satellite Industry Association to testify today on commercial space. As the president of SIA, I'm pleased to represent here the unified voice of the nation's satellite industry, including satellite operators, manufacturers, launch companies, and service and ground equipment providers. Our sector pioneered the commercialization of space. Just over 50 years ago, Telstar 1 was launched as the first privately owned satellite. Today, fleets of satellites ring the globe, owned and operated by private companies from around the world. For the past 16 years, SI has been tracking our sector's performance in an annual State of the Satellite Industry report. Our most recent report, issued in October, showed global satellite industry revenues of nearly $190 billion last year, more than 60% of the world's entire space sector. The U.S. represents just under 45% of the global satellite industry, and U.S. satellite companies employ more than 225,000 Americans across all sectors. Commercial satellites are used to deliver services to every zip code in the U.S. and every continent. Satellite services directly for consumers are the engine driving the industry's overall growth. Satellite TV services alone earned nearly $90 billion in global revenue last year, joined with satellite radio, satellite broadband, and new services like in-flight broadband for airline passengers. Satellites also deliver hundreds of channels of media and broadcasting content everywhere, as seen in the iconic tagline, "Live via satellite," and the ubiquitous satellite news truck. Behind the scenes, we also link far-flung businesses, extend cellular and telecom networks, power emergency communications for first responders, and military communications for national security, and capture the Earth with remote sensing imagery used for everything from agriculture to humanitarian assistance and Google Earth. Satellites are an instant infrastructure that is reliably available every day, everywhere around the world, and we look to governments to maintain certain policy and market conditions to sustain our industry and pave the way for our growth and ongoing innovation. I'd like to highlight here 4 key aspects that drive the way we think about government policies. First, the satellite industry has particularly long business horizons. Satellite orders are typically placed 2 years before they're launched, and once on orbit last about 15 years. While economic and competitive conditions shift, satellite companies thrive with consistent regulatory and business environments. We look for swift and effective licensing for satellites and ground terminals and stable regulatory fees. Dramatic changes in government regulations and policies simply put at risk the hundreds of millions of dollars required to finance the manufacture, launch, and operation of a commercial satellite. Second, the satellite industry is inherently international. We serve entire continents or hemispheres, and U.S. satellite manufacturers compete in a dynamic global marketplace. As a result, international policies and fair trade rules are essential. Congress recently took an important step to support U.S. satellite exports when it passed the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, which permits needed updates to the U.S. export controls on satellite technologies. These reforms, which are now being implemented by the executive branch, will assist the long-term competitiveness of U.S. satellite manufacturers, and for that, we offer our appreciation. Third, the satellite industry relies on radio frequency spectrum. Not only is spectrum used to fly our satellites, but it is the lifeblood of the vast array of communication services provided via satellite. Without spectrum, satellites simply would not function. The telecommunications industry is currently being consumed by a debate over how to allocate spectrum, and satellite frequencies are among those targeted for sharing or wholesale repurposing. The satellite industry has long supported efficient and sensible satellite spectrum policies, but changes require respect for existing critical services and an understanding of the demands of communicating with spacecraft tens of thousands of miles away. Shifts in spectrum policy must be careful, objective, and fact-driven to avert serious implications for satellite systems. Finally, the satellite industry is keenly focused on managing risk. Satellites must be robust enough to navigate a technically challenging launch campaign and survive the harsh environments of outer space. We have close ties with the financial and insurance industries that allow us to mitigate these unique risks and meet the high upfront costs of these satellite projects. While most financing is provided by the private sector, and rightfully so, governments around the world have also stepped in to provide export credit financing for international sales of satellites. SIA encourages Congress to continue to support a strong U.S. export-import bank to allow U.S. manufacturers to compete internationally. Finally, governments have offered indemnification against lawsuits resulting from catastrophic launch failures. Although this protection has never been drawn upon, the U.S. government should offer safeguards comparable to other leading spacefaring nations. SIA strongly supports extending this regime for a minimum of 10 years, if not permanently. In our more than 50 years of experience, the satellite industry has harnessed the power of space to serve national security, connect every corner of the globe, and deliver entertainment to every people on every continent. We fly a third of the satellites on orbit and have posted 10% average annual growth over the past decade, sustaining a robust worldwide space economy. The satellite industry is proud to lead the way for the safe, successful, and sustained commercialization of space. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, this concludes my testimony. On behalf of the members of the Satellite Industry Association, thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. I now recognize our next witness, Mr. Witt.
Chairman Palazzo, Representative Bonamici, Chairman Smith, Mr. McCarthy, members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity of addressing you this morning in the invitation to Congress. My name is Stuart Witt, and I am the CEO of Mojave Air and Spaceport located in southeast Kern County, California. Today our topic is America's commercial space industry, and my message to you from the high desert is that the American engineers and entrepreneurs in Mojave and other places across this great nation are successfully revolutionizing America's future in space. My story today is 100% a good news story. That didn't just happen. This committee enacted into law a Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act in 2004, sponsored by Mr. Rohrabacher, that created an informed consent regime for commercial human spaceflight. By giving us permission to take risks, you enabled us to create a new industry, which is freeing up NASA and others to pioneer deep space exploration. I personally want to thank committee members Takano, Mr. Rohrabacher, Mr. Bridenstine, and Chairman Smith, who have made visits to Mojave on multiple occasions and witnessed firsthand the private sector innovations I'm addressing today. Chairman Palazzo has requested my attention to 4 specific questions, which I will answer in summary here, but I have gone into far greater detail in my written testimony. Question number 1. Please summarize the work underway by commercial space companies at Mojave Air and Spaceport. There is enormous interest in what we offer. Many have asked me, how did I manage to attract firms to Mojave over the past 12 years, doing orbital research, suborbital research and development, deep space propulsion system development, and specifically demonstrated by entrepreneurs and high net worth investors? My response is simple. In a word, I offer permission. We don't advertise, we just deliver. Just as our tenants deliver, we set reasonable constraints, provide value-added services to test operators, and allow the developers to conduct and manage their own programs with remarkable results. What sounds incredibly simple is actually in practice somewhat complex and very rigorous. But again, the results speak for themselves. Mojave Air and Spaceport currently has 17 firms engaged in commercial space research, leading to production of manned and unmanned space systems with 19 separate rocket test sites. Mojave now hosts 156 separate business contracts, employing nearly 3,000 professionals. Specific emphasis is centered on green, non-toxic, liquid, and hybrid rocket propulsion systems, privately funded, complete launch systems to orbit and suborbit, and components for such systems are in development for commercial and government clients. Question number 2. The potential future suborbital space market, question mark. To your question, Mr. Chairman, Mojave is far more than suborbital. Mojave entered this game in the orbital market and found a way to back in the suborbital market. I view this discussion similar to the discussion the world had about steam 175 years ago. Obviously, investors knew it had potential, but they didn't know the answer to the basic question you ask. Today, the majority of the world's power systems are based on steam. We all know that the investment in suborbital tourism, it's in the press every day. But beyond that is an emerging new interest being led by the world's high net worth investors who are visiting Mojave because they know investment in hypersonic, high Mach business travel is ripe for suborbit. This is where I see the needle moving, and my written testimony goes into far greater detail on the subject. Question 3, the challenges and opportunities faced by the suborbital space market. A, the industry needs regulatory certainty, but the learning period restriction on unsubstantiated safety regulations expires in less than 2 years, and the risk-sharing indemnification regime expires at the end of next month. For regulatory certainty, extension of both is required now. The administration's proposed changes to ITAR pose a restriction to extending the peaceful exploration of space to a thirsty world market seeking suborbit vehicles. ITAR, as it currently stands, is more than a speed bump to expanding the markets internationally. Question 4. Your thoughts on H.R. 3038, the Suborbital and Orbital Advancement and Regulatory Streamlining Act. I strongly support 2 elements of H.R. 3038 contained in Section 2, but the third element contained in Section 3 to me is ambiguous and requires further discussion and clarity. For my 44 years as a professional aviator, test pilot, and business executive, if taken at current words, it may take the FAA and the industry into that mysterious land of unintended consequences if we don't spend just a little time and get it right. Again, I thank you for your invitation to present the good news coming out of Mojave, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Witt. I now recognize our final witness, Mr. Tito.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I can't think of a better way to begin today's discussion.
Your mic, please. If you can turn it on. Thank you.
I can't think of a better way to begin today's discussion on the public-private ventures in space than to propose one. At the Inspiration Mars Foundation, we have designed the architecture for a mission carrying 2 astronauts to the far side of Mars and back. It would be a voyage of around 800 million miles around the sun in 501 days. We propose to do this in collaboration with NASA as a partner in a NASA mission in the name of America and for the good of humanity. The endeavor is not motivated by business desires, but to inspire Americans in a bold adventure in space that reinvigorates space exploration. In fact, the capabilities developed through the private funding belong to NASA for this and future missions. The partnership is a new model for a space mission. It is not the model of traditional contracts or subsidies for vehicle developments, although these models are embedded in the NASA programs to be leveraged for this mission. It is a philanthropic partnership with government to augment resources and achieve even greater goals than is possible otherwise. Philanthropy has historically benefited society beyond what governments can afford or justify. What better use is there for private funding than to challenge the imaginations of people all over the world by providing a spark that invigorates the space program to further human destiny, to learn more and improve our civilization. Just as exciting times in the space program have motivated young people to study math, science, and engineering in the past, benefiting all parts of U.S. industry, this mission will surely provide that benefit. No longer is a Mars flyby mission just one more theoretical idea. It can be done, not in a matter of decades, but in a few years. Moreover, the mission might just show the way for a new model for joint effort and financing. It would attract significant private funding while enabling NASA to do what it does best and to confirm that the United States is the unquestioned leader in space. The work of this subcommittee has helped to prepare the way with the 2010 authorization. That gave NASA the Space Launch System, the Orion program, and new commercial capabilities. We propose to combine all of these elements as we have explained in the architecture study report released this week. We can accomplish this flyby within a set launch schedule using rocket systems hardware already in testing and meeting established objectives that is part of the space policy for sending people to explore Mars. But the technology in the rockets and the systems are all virtually there. Why not move this mission to the here and now and not wait until the 30s? There's a compelling reason to do that in the word opportunity. Every 15 years or so, there's a rare planetary alignment relying on gravitational forces of Mars, Sun, and Earth. An American spacecraft would have to be on its way in the first days of 2018. Otherwise, we are looking at another 15 years before that alignment happens again. If we need a plan B, there's a mission 80 days longer that flies behind Venus before going to Mars, being a unique trajectory that could be flown in 2021. However, by then, another country, almost surely China, will have seen our missed opportunity and taken the lead for themselves. May I offer a frank word to the subcommittee? The United States will carry out a flyby mission, or will watch as others do it. If America is ever going to do a flyby mission of Mars, then we're going to have to do it in 2018. Given the Russian recognition and value of accomplishments in human space exploration, they have announced that they will re-commercialize the Energia rocket and make that available. They also have upgrades to their capabilities, which would allow them to fly in 2017. We feel it is our civic duty to bring this attention to the executive and legislative branches of government. In 2019, it will be 50 years since we landed on the moon. Let us hope that we can look back and say that we have accomplished something in that 50 years. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and the subcommittee, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tito. I thank the witnesses for being available for questioning today. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. The current third-party liability risk-sharing regime has been in place for almost 2 decades. The purpose of this regime was to assist a nascent industry that needed a backstop for possible third-party claims in the event of an accident. Please explain to the committee why the indemnification regime is still necessary and what reforms to the current regime are needed. Mr. Witt, Ms. Cooper, you briefly touched on this topic. Will you please explain in detail or elaborate in detail? Thank you. Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Commercial Space Launch Act risk management provision is absolutely essential and an appropriate use for government in the view of the members of the Satellite Industry Association. We strongly recommend that it be renewed before it expires. The government's role in safeguarding for launch services is only at a very extraordinary circumstance. Under the FAA rules and the rules set out under the Launch Act, launch providers themselves are responsible for the bulk of damages that might occur if the unthinkable were to happen. The FAA sets a maximum probable loss limit of $500 million and expects their licensees to take responsibility for those damages, usually in the form of private launch insurance. And I would note that those maximum probable losses cover not only all parties involved in the launch, including third parties, but also damages to U.S. government property. Damages in excess of that maximum probable loss limit of $500 million, up to a cap of $1.5 million, are what are at stake here in this launch liability provision. This was not just to protect a nascent industry, but to ensure that the risk of launching a satellite or any other payload didn't require the company to pretty much bet the company every time they launched. This allowed the largest, most catastrophic damages to be safeguarded by the government. I would note that this is appropriate. I looked back a little bit in 1988 when the first Commercial Space Launch Act was passed. The environment today in the marketplace, with not only several commercial launch companies looking at launching satellites, but also the extraordinary proliferation of interest and investment and exploration of commercial launch for other purposes, is an environment far more like the 1988 environment than it was 5 years ago. I would also note that international competition is far more intense, and other governments, the hosts of those other launch providers, offer comparable safeguards from significant damage. And finally, I would just note that the U.S. government itself carries liability that it's taken on under several treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, the Space Liability Treaty, and these are satisfied by the commercial space launch indemnification provisions, and we certainly think that it is an appropriate role for government and one that this committee, we hope, will support extending. Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Learn my protocols. Mr. Chairman, this particular question is, to me, is just foundational to the right way to do business. There seems to be a perception, and then there's a reality. And the perception is that there's no skin in the game on the part of the operators. And the reality is, the way the law is written, there's $500 million at stake to the operator, plus they play this little game every day in Mojave called Let's Bet the Company every time they fly. There's certainly no motivation to fail. There's certainly a motivation to be rigorous. But for a licensed launch, when it comes down to actually launching, the FAA, the federal government, makes the determination of the maximum probable loss and caps it. And it's the operator that has to find the insurance or post a bond, if you will, that they have financial solvency to cover any losses up to that limit. For 20 years, the government has not been placed at risk. If a program that was put in place is working that well, I would look for some compelling reason to change it. I think it should be extended indefinitely. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Mr. Tito, in your testimony, you talk about a public-private partnership with NASA for a deep space mission, and that, in contrast to past development programs, would be funded at least in part by private investment. How much do you expect this mission to cost private investors? Would those investors expect a return on their investment, or would they be considered donations? And do you intend to ask for NASA for funding, and if so, how much do you plan on asking for?
Well, this is a philanthropic effort, so you would not consider any contribution an investment. Once a mission was established and ongoing, I think there would be the prospect of raising several $100 million philanthropically, but not until we actually have a mission on the manifest. As far as overall cost, over and above what NASA is already spending on existing programs, I would say that it would be less than $1 billion. And you subtract roughly $300 million, which I think could be raised philanthropically over the 5-year period between now and the end of the mission, it would cost the government about $700 million, or about a little over $100 million a year.
Well, thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. One of the things that I've emphasized since joining the subcommittee last year is the importance of educating the public about the benefits of space exploration and justifying the investment, which those of us on the subcommittee all believe in. And one of the things I wanted to point out, and thank you for Mr. Witt, is in your testimony talking about how there's been this spin-off potential beyond aerospace, especially with the discoveries being applied to, for example, conventional internal combustion engines. And I think the more the public knows about benefits beyond that all-important leadership, the more we can convince the public that these are wise investments in space. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Ms. Cooper, the commercial satellite industry is one of the first commercial space industries and has really seen significant growth over the years. So as you consider the range of activities and issues being discussed here today, can you tell us from your experience what lessons have been learned that could benefit the other emerging space enterprises?
Thank you. I think the commercial satellite industry in its origin has some similarities to other younger space ventures in that there were assumptions of a government role at the outset. There was an assumption that the idea of launching a satellite and building one was too complex, too costly, too risky for an individual company or country even to undertake it. As the experience grew and the confidence in the capability on orbit grew, and also as the idea of services and what was the value of those satellites grew, companies naturally entered the arena. I think that was a critical part for government regulation to establish rules of the road for a competitive environment, to allow enabling an environment, but also to establish how those companies would be able to compete with each other and what they for them, what they needed. For the commercial satellite industry, it's absolutely orbital slots, which is an international regime managed by the International Telecommunications Union, but also satellite spectrum, which is needed not only to manage the spacecraft, but also to deliver communication services. That's probably our biggest challenge right now, is that we've become almost so ubiquitous and so relied upon that the communications industry may forget that we're delivering these services from 22,000 miles away, and that there are significant considerations when you figure out how you might be able to share that spectrum. I would also just note the other consideration is safety and safety of flight. That's a genuine role for government regulation, and I think the partnership between industry and government is essential there to establish an understanding of what's in space and an understanding of what the private and government actors in space are doing for the safety of all in space. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And for all of you, the work that your organizations are performing calls for innovation, certainly a highly skilled workforce to achieve the goals, and certainly a competitive environment. So how important is the workforce to the growth of commercial space? And from your perspective, what's the most important thing we can do to ensure the future viability and sustainability of a workforce that's prepared for this type of work? I'll start with Mr. Witt. Your thoughts on that?
Ms. Bonavici, that's a great question, and that goes right to my heart. Last 10 years I've served on 11 years served on a college board, and I've learned a little bit about the education process in America. But for the last 20 years in my businesses and at my current business, I've required each one of my employees to spend 4 hours a year in a classroom. And to a person, when I had my company or when everybody said only 4 hours. And I said, just curious, but how many did you do last year? And we all know the answer to that, don't we? 0. And to set a standard in your own business, and from your seats as members of Congress, you have the opportunity to speak to people all over this nation all the time. You all get invited for public events. People listen to your words, your policy and your words. Make it part of your daily speech to promote science and technology nationwide in this nation. Do the little things. When you walk into a mast and space system, and I bring in teachers, we brought in students, but we now found out, teachers in classrooms, like I think I learned in our discussion at lunch one day, they have all the kids. If we bring them in for an hour, we have 100 kids and me for an hour. But these teachers have the kids all year long. Bring the teachers in. Spend a day with 30 teachers, and they have access to these kids for a year. Show them the passion. Show them the people. Take them into a mast in space systems and let them ask an engineer, if you could talk to your science teacher today in high school, what would you tell him? I remember that question specifically. And the kid with the wrenches and the T-shirts building a rocket says, it would have been nice of you to come by my desk every now and then, but you're always worried about the lowest kid in the class or the brightest kid in the class, but somewhere I was lost in the middle. Those are powerful things to learn on the shop floor of a rocket factory. But those are lessons we can extend and you can extend in all of your daily activities in lunchrooms. Make it the standard that people make every employee that works for them spend 4 hours a year in a classroom. My janitor, who's trilingual, spends 4 hours a year in a classroom. There's a job for every kid, and their job is important.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I've run out of time. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Rohrbacher.
I didn't know. I thought it was going to be down the line a bit. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate the witnesses, and certainly appreciate the leadership of the chairman on this, making sure that we focus on this element of America's space program. This element of America's space program is playing an ever increasingly vital role. I'd like to first of all give my regards to Dennis Tito here, who years ago took the initiative to show that one person could make a difference and could inspire a whole nation. It's one thing to have a group of people working for the government working together to accomplish something. It's one thing for this guy to on his own decide he's going to get something done and go out and do it. And I remember the first time I met Mr. Tito, we went out for dinner, and the waiter in the restaurant where we went, "Aren't you the guy who went into space?" And talk about inspiring people. I mean, this was he was inspiring regular Americans out there, and thanks for doing that, Dennis, and not giving up on that job of inspiring people. I will hopefully work with you on your project. I don't know if we can get it done, but we'll see what we can do. And it's inspiring to see you doing this. Ms. Cooper, I want to get to some really basics here. One of the things that are limiting our ability to use space, commercial space and otherwise, is orbital debris. And at what point are we reaching a point now where we're going to have to put the lid on what we're doing in space because of this problem?
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. For the commercial satellite industry, we do not think that the orbital debris environment is limiting our ability to deploy new satellites. It does affect our operations. I will say that the commercial satellite industry takes extremely seriously its responsibilities to operate in space and to assist in the larger question of debris. I want to point to a private initiative that many of the satellite operators have undertaken called the Space Data Association, in which a number of satellite companies have pooled their resources to explain where they are in very specific ephemeris data, also to share information about what they see on orbit, and also discuss EMI, RFI interference issues.
Well,
they share that with the Strategic Command as well.
Well, that's very commendable. This is happening on a voluntary basis with your industry. I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that dealing with the ever-increasing level of space debris might be one use of commercial space. There might be commercial people who commercially would like to go out and get the contract to dealing with space debris. And rather than simply make this a government program, it could be, we could look at it as a potential commercial program. And I'd also like to, I mentioned Mr. Tito, I'd like to mention Jim Muncie, who is sitting back behind the panel today, who never got credit for enormous things that were getting done in this committee and in commercial space. Thank you, Mr. Muncie. One note about how Mr. Tito mentioned the Chinese might be doing things. I would suggest this, however. The Chinese get a lot of their technology by stealing it, and I would hope that we don't let thieves beat us to various important goals in space, but I would also hope that we don't partner with thieves. And until we see reform in China, we should not be partnering in space ventures with the world's worst human rights abuser. And finally, Mr. Witt, what would you say? You're right there in the front. As I just mentioned, space debris. Could you give us a couple of ideas of where commercial space? Are we going to have a ride between? Are we going to be able to deliver a Federal X package yesterday to Tokyo?
It's certainly in the possibility. I think, and one of the members have recently asked me, what's the time frame for point-to-point suborbit travel halfway around the world? And is it 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? I think the answer is it could be in the 10-year regime. It's more likely going to be in the out years. But we certainly ought to be thinking there now. It's time for us to take the long view of the future and start setting the stage for policies and planning for it today. This is not revolutionary. This is frankly evolutionary. It's going from props to jets. Now we're going from jets to faster jets and air breathers and using a different band of the atmosphere. But it's certainly possible, and I hope it happens in my lifetime, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your leadership, and let me just note on the last point that was made that suborbital space and the development of that for the benefit of mankind is being done basically through private investment, and that's something we can be very proud of, that our innovators are capitalists, and Mr. Tito, by the way, is the ultimate capitalist involved in this, that people are putting their own resources to this, and suborbital space could change the very nature of transportation and again lead us to a new era of humankind. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Bear.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as a child who grew up in the 1960s and early 70s in the heart of the space race, obviously it captured our imagination. I think everyone in this room who grew up in that era would love to see that sense of curiosity, that sense of awe and wonder that inspired, multiple industries, inspired many of us to go into science and, inspired a generation. The challenge I have right now is, my 1 year in Congress, and I'll ask the members on the panel, could you in a sentence clearly define what NASA's mission is today, what we're trying to accomplish in a way that, President Kennedy clearly defined what we were aspiring to within a specific time frame and so forth. And, as a member of the Space Committee, I think I have a hard time. So I'd ask you what our mission is today, the one that inspires folks, that's clearly been articulated to the public.
The commercial satellite industry is a little bit adjacent to NASA, so I'm going to yield to my colleagues on the panel.
Sir, it's outside my area of expertise, but I do get asked that regularly, and my answer is not changed. America deserves, expects, and demands a forward-leaning, well-funded, laser-focused national space agency focused on the big jobs, the big deals. Where the commercial industry should fill gaps, we should fill the gaps, and we should be allowed to fill those gaps in earnest, and it's private enterprise. But we deserve, expect, and demand a forward-leaning, well-funded, laser-focused national space agency.
Mr. Tito.
Well, in 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, that changed the world as far as I was concerned, and put America in the minds of a lot of people in the world as a number 2 technologically. And one of our responses was to form NASA to lead our space program. And the role of NASA, of course, was for scientific purposes, to develop technology like the preceding firm NACA did for the aircraft industry. But the real mission of NASA at the beginning, as we all know, was to win the space race. And we did win it after 10 years, and somehow we don't have that drive that we had 50 years ago. And we may be in a position of having Sputnik occur again. And Sputnik will be a flight to Mars by either China or Russia.
Well, would it be reasonable then to push the administration as well as the NASA administrator to perhaps define manned space travel, human space travel to Mars within a certain time frame as a mission that the public can grasp, that then within that context we could look at, well, what's the role of the private sector and commercial space travel to help us get there, as well as what's the role of the federal sector in terms of NASA and the funds that we would have to appropriate. But again, I would challenge the administration as well as the NASA administrator to clearly define that, because then it makes our jobs a lot easier to say, okay, well, what framework allows us to both take the public sector and the private sector working together in an innovative way to go out there, capture the public imagination.
Look, we're at a point where we have to make a decision as a nation. We can either make a decision to spend a relatively small amount of additional funds to a very expensive human exploration program now that does not have a mission, and make a mission out of it and be the first to get to Mars, or by not making a decision, we will be forfeiting that opportunity. Now, in 2021, we could get to Mars, but we may not be the only ones. It's an interesting mission. It's Venus and Mars. And of course, we're proposing a man and a woman. That would make a very interesting combination. But I think we have to really look at this opportunity very seriously and decide one way or another as to whether the United States should pass on it or act on it.
Great. I think that's a great place to end. I'll yield back.
Just to add, Mr. Bear asked the same question a lot of us have been asking ourselves, and we get asked it a lot. And I would just like to reiterate, that's one of the reasons why the NASA Authorization Act is so important. It does establish a roadmap for NASA so we can come up with a timeline, destinations, and focus, laser-like focus, and back it up with our resources to achieve that objective. So this time I recognize Mr. Breinstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just really like to thank the panel. I firmly believe we do have an opportunity to advance rocket science and space technology in the private sector, in many cases, apart from the whimsical budgets of us politicians. And what you guys are doing in that area is unique and special, and you're really leading the way, and I appreciate that very much. What I'd like to ask Mr. Witt, part of your testimony, you talked about ITAR and some of the regulations that are affecting the commercial spaceflight industry, maybe space tourism. Would you share with us a little bit about how ITAR is affecting the businesses and the industry at the Mojave Air and Space Port?
Sure. Mr. Bridenstine. Got that right?
Yes, sir.
ITAR. If you have a rocket and you have a human attached to that rocket, you're born into ITAR. So you're regulated by the International Treaty on Arms regulations. The developers at Mojave, let's just put a name to them, Maston, X-Corp, and Virgin Galactic, all seek to make their industry a worldwide industry. They want to take American products and extend them around the globe. One of those investors happens to be an international investor, Sir Richard Branson. So isn't it ironic that an international investor developing a system in the United States, currently under current law, can't fly it outside the United States? I believe we have grown up a new day. There are new products. We have agreements all around the world with nations that want to explore space for peaceful purposes. Space tourism is a great example. If I could choose a location where I would like to fly a suborbital space flight, I'd like to fly through the Aurora Borealis out of northern Sweden. It's fast. Why not? Fly at night. Do something that no one else has done, like Mr. Tito suggests. This is what's possible. But unless we find some relief on the ITAR regulations and really crack that can open and take a look, I don't think we're going to be able to extend these things internationally, and we need to. It's good for American business.
When you think about the market for whether it's space tourism or private space, suborbital science experiments and exploration, that market exists in large part outside our own country. While it does exist in our own country, could you give maybe an example of how big that market would be if we were able to take that market outside the United States?
The Tory Group is a great place to ask that question. I'm not expert in that, but I do know the studies are out there and the numbers exist, and I would recommend to the committee that you ask for that, maybe through the CSF. But it is a market. Like Mr. Tito said, if we don't provide the services, they're going to buy the services from providers that are willing to provide the services. They're out there. Right. I think we need to be in the game in all corners, and I think you're not trying to find relief. I totally agree with Mr. Rohrbacher's comments, but ITAR is more than a speed bump as currently written.
When you think about investment in the private spaceflight industry, we think about high net worth investors. Can you share what is the resistance, or is there resistance to receiving investment from institutional investors? Is that is it happening? Is it slow to happen? Can you share a little bit about that?
I don't have any examples of that currently. The majority of my tenants are the high net worth investor. Some institutional investing is starting to show up. I have said for years we'll have an industry when we have an underwriter, right, and we have Wall Street. We're starting to show signs of both. But I think it took some successes, namely by SpaceX, now Orbital Sciences, now Boeing. It's going to take new day, new players in the system showing enormous successes to start drawing in the more institutional, conventional investment. And I think it's beginning to happen.
And of course, indemnification, which you guys are very interested in, is a key piece of attracting that kind of institutional investor. Is that correct?
It brings certainty to the game, absolutely. And sure. I think that we look to the government to be a good partner. We can't keep moving the goalposts or changing the rules. The indemnification regime is sound policy. It's worked.
Right.
And the operators have the skin in the game first, and then the government's portion has never been used.
Roger that. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Vesey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask you a little bit about commercial space activities and pop culture. I know that you probably have saw that Lady Gaga is going to be the first person to perform in space. I think that's going to happen sometime in 2015, and I believe she's going to. I think it is in conjunction with Richard Branson. And just wondering what you thought, pop culture and how maybe it can play a role in sort of aiding or just getting people more interested in what's going on in commercial space travel.
Is that for me, Mr. Vesey?
Yes.
Okay. Lady Gaga. Okay. I got to admit, I didn't know I was going to get this question in front of Congress. I'll tell you, I do have an answer for that. I think you raise a valid question. When you talk about the totality of an industry, industries usually come along with different things like fashion, food, housing. All those certain elements are key to commercial space. What will you take? What provisions do you need? How long do you plan to be on this journey? What do you wear? All these questions. But the industry on the ground around that tends to mirror trends. And I don't know anything about the Lady Gaga, Sir Richard Branson thing you mentioned. It's a little out of scope for Mojave. But I do know that fashion design and pop culture, that Rocket Man.
Elton John.
Elton John.
Right.
I mean, there you go. I play it every time we launch a rocket. It's certainly important to capture the young people and to get them engaged. It certainly has a role, and I think it's greater than just the pop culture. It's more fashion, design, food, the whole industry.
Do you think there's anything that NASA could possibly learn because one of the things about Richard Branson, like for instance, even in commercial air travel, if you go to his airline, whenever you're getting your ticket at the kiosk, they're playing Red Hot Chili Peppers. It's a different sort of a vibe, and obviously some of the things that they're doing with pop culture and this Lady Gaga flight is really interesting. Do you think there's something that NASA can learn in order to maybe inspire a lot of young people that may be interested in space travel, or may even maybe be able to sort of catapult space travel to what it probably was like back in the 1970s and early 80s for a lot of young people?
It's possible, but it's an engineering organization, and engineers don't tend to think in terms of pop culture. It doesn't come oozing out of them naturally. But certainly NASA could use a dose of marketing skills that come from the Branson organization. They are absolute expert at that, in selling the brand and selling the concept. You would think that the NASA experience that I grew up with and watched on TV that brought me into this industry, it could use a jolt of reinvention. And what I think you're really asking is, what's the value to the buying public? If you have a choice of buying airlines, if you've ridden on a Virgin flight, they're different. They're fun. That brings value to the exchanging money for your ticket. Maybe there's a value proposition that needs to be revisited in the rebranding, rediscovery of the future NASA.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I now recognize Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Though I don't know if I'm going to be able to reach the heights of pop culture sort of inquiry, but I guess I could embarrass my wife and go, "Who's Lady Gaga?" But in all sincerity, okay, privatization, private ventures. Now the next question is on the financing, the access to capital. When I look at much of what I see in the private investments and what's going on in Mojave, I don't want to I'm going to refer to it somewhat as vanity capital. Some of the ventures are funded substantially with a handful of high net worth individuals with great hopes and dreams because it's their interest, their hobby. Where are we going on the financing mechanisms where the investment side? Now, we know the satellite industry now has some terrific rates of return. Where's the next level of investment where I see a investment index that is where it's a more we'll refer to as sort of egalitarian investment mechanic? How far away? Please give me some concepts of where the money is going and coming from.
Well, about 10 years ago, I actually did consider making an investment in one of those organizations that you referred to at Mojave. And somehow I just wasn't able to pencil it together as an investment that would provide return on investment, and given the risk involved. And one of the problems with investing in space programs is that you have to develop a business model. And the business model is, how much are people going to pay to participate in a certain mission? And as you know, there were 7 people that paid to fly orbiting the Earth on space station with the Russians at a fairly high price. And that market is limited.
Well, and maybe part of this is from Ms. Cooper. We do now see, I guess, a series of very standardized, structured investments to finance communication satellites, satellites that drive data. From your view of the world from the satellite industry, is that the future for other types of financing mechanisms?
Thank you. Certainly the experience in the commercial satellite industry is three parts: inspiration, the creative aspects, which sometimes comes from governments or countries or groups, multilateral groups, but in the satellite industry certainly had individual high net worth investors like Renee and Selmo, who founded PenAmSat, the first company I worked at. An absolutely untenable plan.
But literally,
and then
your
you have
third.
to, if I may go then to the second piece, which is you have to show a certain technical capability to deliver the service. And finally, you have to close a business case to show how you're going to sustain what is typically a high upfront investment cost. That, at that third phase, on a sustainable rate of return kind of approach is where the more traditional investors respond.
Yeah, I mean, let's say it was this afternoon, and we decided that putting money into a satellite. Typically, my understanding is most satellite launches are sponsored. It's we're a company, it's communication. We need 40% of the drive or the bandwidth capacity. The rest will be sold off. The ability do they sell interest in that? Could I find an exchange or a broker or a platform to buy and sell and finance that launch?
I'm not aware of any exchanges for the launch. What I can say is that the commercial satellite piece of it.
Well, and when I say that, I mean the whole package.
The commercial satellite nowadays is almost the financial environments reward a satellite with an established pre-launch customer base. Often as much as 80% of the satellite's capability is booked pre-launch.
Okay.
And then the excess of that is sold after the launch, after the satellite's been put in orbit over the course of its 15-year lifespan. There are certainly satellites that are speculative, that are built with a customer base to be determined.
I'd like to learn more about that because a year ago I was approached by some folks that literally wanted to set up. Closest thing I could refer to it as like a REIT that would be based in financing the construction, the maintenance, the launch of a satellite, and literally selling its bandwidth. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
I now recognize Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to Ms. Bonamici for sitting in for me earlier. I had a conflict. I really appreciate our witnesses here today. Mr. Tito, it's good to see you again. I want to reiterate, and I know my statement's been submitted for the record, but I want to reiterate to Chairman Palazzo my commitment to working with him and with the chairman and the ranking member for a clean one-year extension of the commercial launch indemnification provisions. And I hope that over this next year we really will take to the task of doing the kind of oversight hearings that we need to give the commercial space industry the kind of certainty that we need with respect to indemnification. And we can only do that if we get the FAA in here and get experts in so that we can look at the future environment and climate with respect to commercial activity. But I do support a clean one-year extension as we're approaching that date of December 31st. To all of the panelists, I think that much of what we think of as commercial space really involves a lot of significant government contribution, and sometimes we don't hear that. And in fact, the delineation between public and private appears increasingly blurred. As somebody who came out of NASA, I think it's always been a little bit blurred, and that's okay. But how should Congress in its oversight role look at the role of public-private relationships to ensure that both taxpayers and commercial entities' interests are appropriately considered? And then I would like each of you, if you would give me an indication as to whether you know how much, in fact, taxpayers have contributed to the current commercial environment.
For the commercial satellite sector, there's not a taxpayer contribution. These are privately financed, privately launched privately operated satellites. Obviously, there's government regulatory regimes that license and oversee those. It is my understanding at the FCC, for example, that those license fees are cost-based in terms of the agencies.
What about the technology that went into the commercial satellite industry?
Yeah,
any idea of the contribution of NASA or any of our agencies in terms of their contribution?
I'm not aware of any government programs to develop commercial satellite technology. There certainly is an interplay between the commercial satellite sector and the broader space enterprise, where products that are developed in the NASA context may later be commercialized.
Thank you. Mr. Tito, in the architecture report that's attached to your statement, it says that, quote, perhaps several $100 million in new federal spending could make this mission happen. Are you suggesting that the mission couldn't be undertaken without additional NASA funding? And is there evidence in the current fiscal environment that those several $100 million would be available?
Well, right now I don't see a lot of evidence that money is available. We do have an opportunity in 4 years, but we have an opportunity in 8 years, and a lot can happen.
So when you say several $100 million would be required from NASA, is that $100 million? Is it $900 million?
Well, I think initially we're talking about per year, so it might be 100 to 200 million a year would be needed to fund the dual-use upper stage, which the nation needs anyway to provide heavy lift capability. So that would be one project that would have to take place.
And that would require taxpayer support, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's already planned, but it's not funded yet over the longer term period.
And Mr. Witt, do you have an idea of how much taxpayer support has gone into the commercial activities that you're engaged in or that others of your partners are?
Ms. Edwards, I can only speak to Mojave Air and Spaceport. We're a California special district, so we're a quasi-government entity that can qualify for federal grants that from the FAA and others. And I think I gave that to the committee, and I could give you a number, but the exact number was submitted in my packet. But it was a good question, and we did extend a runway, and we, I think, bought a fire truck. So we're talking in terms of a couple $1 million. But my organization, if we don't make money, I don't pay my employees. I don't get any operational funds from anyone. I have to run as a business, and so there has been some public investment, but it's in terms of my total operation, it's small.
Yeah, and I'll close, Mr. Chairman. I guess the point is, and I don't mind that, and I really do understand that the point of the commercial space industry is to make money, but I think sometimes the public gets confused as though somehow this industry would just be off and going on its own without the requisite support of technology and other kinds of development and investment that the taxpayers made. And I think we get a great benefit for the bargain, but I don't want to pretend that we can engage in this activity without the hand of the taxpayer in there helping it out. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a very interesting hearing this morning. And bringing in Lady Gaga just made it even more exciting and for people to look forward to. I have a question for Ms. Cooper. In your statement, you note the Satellite Industry Association's support for extending the U.S. commercial launch indemnification regime, which expires at the end of this year. How, in concrete terms, would the absence of the indemnification provisions affect the U.S. commercial satellite industry in terms of price, market share, or revenues? And on what data do you base your conclusions?
Thank you. I don't have any statistical surveys for that question specifically. I will note that the commercial satellite sector primarily has not been launched by U.S. launch vehicles over the past 5 years, certainly. Those launches are primarily held by European or Russian satellite operators, but there's a great deal of interest in the emerging capabilities of new and existing extension of satellite launch providers for the U.S. Absent the commercial launch indemnification, we expect that the prices for launches would have to incorporate additional risk assumed by the launch providers, perhaps affecting the competitiveness of those U.S. providers in that international launch community. I don't have a data on how much that would be on that speculation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Witt, the SOARS Act seeks to introduce a number of provisions to streamline commercial spaceflight. I'd like to understand from your perspective what is missing from the existing law that needs fixing, and how, in your view, the SOARS Act would address those issues.
Okay, Ms. Wilson. The SOARS Act, as presented, has two provisions, I believe, in Section 2 and one in Section 3. And the two in Section 2 basically provide one-stop shopping for an applicant seeking a license to operate. And currently, it almost have to understand the FAA to understand the provision in the law. But the way the FAA is organized, they have people that manage air traffic control, they have people who fund airports, they have people who license pilots and aircraft and maintainers, and then they have people who license launches. Well, we have a new day. Now we have airplanes, purpose-built airplanes that are stage one that carry a rocket aloft and then launch. So you have this hybrid. Where does it fit? And it creates, again, some uncertainty in the current law because we have new developments. And the law just aims to streamline that in Section 2. The Section 3 provision, and it really is a great provision where commercial companies can provide training for participants who choose to buy tickets to go to suborbit on commercial lines. It's a mechanism for training these people to make them aeronautically adaptable to the flight they're about to take. If you can imagine being in a very confined space with 6 colleagues for an hour to go to space, it would, I think, if you spent $250,000 or $100,000 for that experience, it's reasonable from a business perspective to assume that all of you had similar training before the experience, so you could handle it physiologically. That's what Provision 3 intends to allow. The question I had in my testimony was, does that belong under AVS at FAA or does it belong under AST? And when I reasoned myself through that and spoke to the experts, of which I'm probably one, if I had questions about it, I think it could, if we don't get it right, and I think it's a good measure, I just want to get it right the first time where we're not going down the land of unintended consequences because of how you work within the FAA. I think if you leave it up to the administrator or leave it up to the Secretary of Transportation to solve it, I think they'll find a way to solve it within the agency. But I think it's a good provision. I just don't know if the way it's written is clean.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. I yield back the balance of my time.
All right. At this time, without objection, the chair recognizes Mr. Takano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate this opportunity. Mr. Witt, I really did enjoy my visit to Spaceport. What you have there is a tremendous ecosystem of entrepreneurs and researchers, and it calls to mind the early days of Silicon Valley, and I wish you well in your enterprise. Ms. Cooper, I'm curious about your comments about the spectrum. What are you specifically saying needs to be done? Do we need to reserve a certain part of that spectrum for your industry? And tell me, is it not possible for your industry to actually compete in an auction for the spectrum vis-a-vis the communication companies?
Thank you. The commercial use of radio frequencies spectrum is regulated by the FCC and coordinated internationally with the International Telecommunications Union. There are existing allocations for satellite services of a variety of different ways. It's enormously complex. We have a number of different swaths of the radio spectrum. The issue today comes from this press towards trying to find additional spectrum to allow new services, more broadband to your mobile phone, more services throughout the telecommunications world. And how can we share and make efficient use of that spectrum? The concern that the satellite industry has is that those ideas of collaborating and sharing frequencies need to be thought of a little differently for satellite services. We need very clean spectrum to communicate so far away. And we file regularly at the FCC and engage regularly with both the FCC as the regulator of commercial spectrum and NTIA at Commerce, the regulator of federal spectrum, to make sure that if they're considering adding another unlicensed user or co-primary or secondary user in the frequencies that we're already using, have invested in and have spacecraft spinning away for 15 years, that we can continue to use that frequency not only with high reliability but with a high level of quality that media customers, broadband customers, U.S. military require.
Well, thank you, Mr. Witt. I also visited, the Dryden Space Center at Edwards, along with my visit to Spaceport. What struck me there was the tremendous research going on there, and you and I talked about the role of basic scientific research or the partnership. I'm concerned about our country losing its preeminence or its exceptionalism in research and development of new technologies. And would you support more money available for aerospace research or that end of NASA? People forget that NASA also has it's an aeronautical as part of its mission.
Yeah, Mr. Takano, yes, in a short version, and we've done something beyond that. David McBride, the center director of NASA Dryden, and I were on a trip to Europe together, and we decided that we would do a home-on-home. We would actually trade engineers for a year. An engineer from NASA Dryden would come to work for me, and we'd find a way to work in kind the other way. So they found out there was a mechanism within NASA to do that. And we're just completing that first year. Mr. John Kelly worked with us at Mojave, and it was a way that we thought was a fantastic way to share ideas, best practices, to actually institutionalize some of these lessons learned at the people's investment, if you will, back to Mojave and with the other companies. There is a lot that can be done endo-atmospheric research by the National Space Agency through Dryden, very much so. I very much support.
Well, real quick, can anyone tell me who indemnifies the European launches, since they are so many of our satellites? Do we know if the European Union subsidizes those or not? Be interesting to find that out. Also, I want to put a plug in for the wonderful simulator experience I had, and I would love to see more opportunities for young people to visit the Dryden Center and also participate in some of their experimental flights. That would be a great way to try to promote STEM education. I appreciate the common interest that I share with my conservative friend, Mr. Rohrabacher, and private space initiatives in California. It's one where you and I share a common interest. Yeah. I yield back, sir.
The gentleman yields back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.